Alright, we are Team Wednesday, and just as a quick reminder, we are in charge of creating a pet application for Cordero. And so to start off with this Scrum, what we were focusing on was creating our front end is our pet card components and our pet list components. And then from there, when we're looking at our back end, we're mainly focusing on our pet CRUD functionality and implementing all of that. We go ahead and have Fahad and Alex will be talking about the front end design and so on and so forth.
Alright, so hey guys, since this was our first development sprint, we were pretty conservative on what we wanted to accomplish. So that being the components of the pet card for the user dashboard, and then the pet list component for the employee dashboard. So if we get into the code, so here's the JavaScript file for the pet card. So we have our pet card set up where it's passing in two attributes, that being the name and type, and we're sending that in as a prop. And also, as you can see from the code, we also have hyperlinks. So like when you click click the pet card, it'll send you to a pet profile page, which we haven't worked on at the moment. For pet list cards are the cards displayed in the list. So beforehand, we were using the regular pet card component inside our list, but for pet list card, we're now separated it completely to show different information. And then the pet list just takes that pet list cards and uses a mapping function to display all that information. So if we get right into the page, it's already running, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. So here's the home page. So right here we have we're using React Bootstrap to display everything, since it already has a card component. So we already have so for the card component, we have the image and our two attributes, that being name and type of animal, and we also have a ferret button, which does nothing right now. So also we done basic routing features. So if you click the card, it'll send you to a pet profile page, which is very basic. And then for the employee dashboard, we have its own page for now, where it displays a list, and it shows the two attributes just like the pet card, that being the name and type. And we also have two buttons, update and delete. Updating being for updating the information such as name, type, and bio description, and deleting for deleting from the database. And we also have an add button, which will allow employees to add more animals to the database. So we also did basic testing. So I'm gonna let Fahad get into that.
Yeah, so first we went and did some testing for the components. For example,
you just click on them at the top.
Yeah, so for the pet card test, at this, because we're passing in props, we would like pass in one pet with just name and type at the moment. And for the testing, we tested if it rendered on the document without crashing. And basically it would get by the test ID that we have in the pet card test, or the pet card component. Right here. And it would look for that, and then it would just render it onto the document. And I applied the same logic for the pet list test. But in this case, we had to pass an array of pets, and then it did the same, where it would just check if it rendered properly without crashing. And I applied the same other logic for example, the employee dashboard page and the pet profile. It was a similar rendering check. And to show you the coverage, so as you can see, it checked the components, the pet card, pet list, and the pet list card. Pet list card being the actual card for the list view, and has 100% code coverage. And yeah, as far as tests, that's what we have. We plan to add more later on when we implement like more pages and more components. But
me and Conrad were both working on the back end. What I worked on was setting up a basic MVC Spring framework capable of basic CRUD operations. So here is our pet controller right here. Here is the request that it would receive right here, /pet. I have a delete pet by ID. I set up a get pets. That'll return a list of all the pets on the actual database. I also should mention that I set up an embedded MongoDB service. So kind of to start up on the testing for the database. We haven't connected to the actual database yet, but we're using that at the moment. So where was I? I had a get all pets right here, and I've got a post pet right here, and I've got a put pet right here. This is to update pets that are already in the database. And Conrad, if you want to show an example of it, show that it's actually working.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So before we show the example, I'll just show that we also have our pet models. To create our models, we're using, well, obviously like the private function or strings, but then we're using Lombok to take care of creating the actual getters and setters and all our default constructors, just because that way it saves us from writing a lot of code, and we can less code, less places to look for errors. We think it's a good design decision. And then, okay, so yeah, and then we have our data transfer objects as well as, yeah. Oh, I forgot about token service. And then our pet repository right now is just an interface for the Mongo repository. And yeah, it just extends that functionality. So if we go to Postman, yes. Oh, well, so I guess first I'll show you the tests. Oh, that's not indicative of their tests, I just interrupted it. Okay, so if we do Gradle, we have a default Gradle script that auto cleans, builds, and then gives us testing and testing coverage. So right now we are passing all our tests, but we're not sure we're designing the best quality test, and that's something that we're going to focus on in the next week. But yeah, so if we go to the actual code, we can do our post request to create a pet.
Do a get first, just to show that it's empty.
So we can do a get. I don't know if it's empty.
Okay, fine. Just use me.
So we're gonna do a delete first to remove the pet by the ID. It returns a message. Our message is just delete pet right now. We thought that functionality could come in handy for stuff later. So if we do a post, I should be able, or we can check that the pet is now gone. So we can send, should respond with an empty array. If I scroll down, it responds with an empty array. Our post functionality, create the pet, scroll down, returns the pet. Now, if we run the same get function, it returns our pet. And then if we wanted to update it and say that it was actually a child, we'll get a message that says it was updated, and then we'll see that reflected in the actual JSON. So I think that's it.
Want to show the test?
So with our testing, we are not sure exactly if we're doing it correctly. It was only today that we kind of realized that some of our tests are a more complicated assert true than just always assert true. And it wasn't until Fahad showed us how to look at our test coverage with Jacoco that we realized that we were writing these improper tests. But that's something that we've been working on pretty much all today, and we have another commit that's waiting that is setting up the test for our controllers, which is what we're working on right now. I think they're actually here's the first of it. So if you look, we're using Mockito to mock the actual objects, and then returning the type, and then right now this is just saying if it's any type. That needs to be refactored and built out to then test the specific functions of if, you know, something specific is going on, right? So instead of doing collections, we might do a pet list and then check that the first one's name is exactly the same and all that functionality. So we have a few tests there, and then we have our test models for the stuff like the DAO. We were having trouble figuring out how we actually wanted to test these objects. They're pretty simple if we look at the DAO. It's just you know, interacting with our repository layer. So yeah, that's that, and yeah, I think that's it. So I think that's all of it. Any other?
Try to read section. Yeah,
Just get you set up for ease.
So as was mentioned, we are not connected to the database yet, but that doesn't mean that we don't have data to initialize a ready state. Over the last week, as you can see, we have created JSON data and we have the command to put it into Mongo. This might change slightly as far as how backend would call the files or the functions to put it into Mongo using the connection through the backend. We have also created some data for a user list, as well as a few employees. And if need be, we also have a way to reset the database just in case we want to use this as part of our testing after the connection is finalized through the backend. Sean?
Okay, so I do want to just reiterate that this sprint did mark the beginning of our team starting to code. So everything that you see was done in this sprint. Also, I finally want to say that I think it should be mentioned that we are actually having a great relationship with our sponsor. They're very communicative with us, and we haven't had an issue with them yet. We this previous Scrum, we did have an in-person meeting rather than a usual like over the phone or over Microsoft Teams as we've been using. And the thing about using these in-person meetings, we've realized that this is very helpful for not only them, but for us to get feedback on what they're expecting. And it's also helpful for them saying like, oh, where we are in our actual sprint. And the feedback that we get back is just almost instantaneous. And so it's been a great help, and I'm glad that we're moving forward using that type of design when it comes to our Scrum meetings. Besides that, I think that's it. If anyone has.
I have one more thing to add.
Go ahead.
Going for back to the front end, when Alex is going over the code for the pet card, right now we have it to where we're passing in like hard-coded pet and pet list, but the components have been made to where whenever we have the back end connected to the front end, it'll just work with the props that we have set up in our component. So that's also something that we will be working on